Yeah, if anything happens and I'm too loud, sometimes airplanes fly above me, just mute me.
Excellent. Well, just so you know, we are live, and I don't think Twitter has ads like Twitch does. Hello, everybody. I see the numbers rolling in. It's good to see you today. I will be hosting. Justin has a conflict, but I'm so excited to be here with the lovely Mike, who's on, nope, always mess it up, who's on this side of me. Hey, Mike.
How's it going? I need to mute you because I have the YouTube to have the chat open. I'm hearing you twice, and I mentally get confused. Getting asynchronous things together is hard. So, but I figured it out. I'm good. Ready for the show today.
I am so excited for our two lovely guests. Above me, I have Pawel, and then to my angle, I have Igor, because that's a word. Welcome, welcome. I could not be more excited about not only our guests, but our topic today. But let's do a brief introduction. Pawel, can you introduce yourself for those who don't know you?
Yeah, sure. So, like, I'm a long-time open source contributor to Angular project. Was messing with those guys for years. So I'm not working for Google. I'm working for a company called Amadeus. But we've got this very nice setup where my employer is using Angular a lot, and like we want to give back to the community and contribute, and that's why I can spend most of the time like working with those guys, which is awesome.
Cool. Very cool. And Igor, tell us about yourself.
I'm Igor, software engineer at Google, and I get to work with awesome people like Pawel on a project called Angular. And I've been with Angular for a long time, so I'm excited to be here and talk to you all about what we are doing in the Angular land.
So I see everybody saying hi. It's good to see you. Hey, everybody. Let us know your questions. I will pull them in as we go. But our topic for today is the latest RFC. And Pawel, I'm going to share your screen whenever you're ready. But I don't know if you have the RFC pulled up, but I can pull it up if not, just to show everyone what we're talking about. But it is for standalone components, which it's got a very long name. Can someone say it for me? It's the RFC was very thoughtful with its.
It is a long name because we have two groups of entities in Angular that are often being marginalized, and we didn't want to leave them out. So it's directives and pipes. Pawel, do you want to do the introduction?
No, I think like maybe like before like diving into the actual RFC and like the details of it, I think like it's important that like we share context, and I think like you had this very nice Twitter thread where you just said like how those things came to be, because like every time like there is a RFC like just kind of dumped to the internet at large, you just like, for me it's very hard to know like, is there something that someone just like was taking shower in the morning, dump his thoughts, and then we go with it, or this
That's
is
how
like,
it happens.
yeah,
Shower, really.
That's a good advice. But other than this, I was like, like how do I know is this thing is legit, right? Like how much thinking went into it, and I think like Igor's background story has like something to say to it.
Oh, there's a background story.
Yeah, I'm going to share the link
story
with you, Alyssa. You can maybe post it somewhere where people can see it in case they missed it.
I am testing that. Mike, did that show up in the chat on the tubes? I tested the.
It did.
It did?
Yes.
So I have link sharing power, is what you're telling me.
Good.
Excellent. Okay.
Good.
So if you want to private chat me the link on the right-hand side, I will post all links because I have the
that's the right one. Yeah.
Thank you. I see it. Perfect. Okay. Okay. So I posted it, and then I can also pull it up if you want while we. Okay. And then I will share my screen. So chat, I shared with you the tweet. Chrome tab, Twitter, share.
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, so a little bit of context. And Pawel, please jump in anytime I miss something or get something wrong, or you have something to add.
No worries.
Just interrupt me. So in Angular, we have many things, many APIs that people work with to build their applications, and ng module is one of them. And ng module is this glue entity that stitches everything together and makes it all work. And people don't often question why we have ng modules, at least not today anymore. Things were different in the past, and they just got used to it. But we've been forever bothered by the presence of ng modules in Angular, because we always felt like ng modules were unnecessary complexity. It was this necessary evil that we couldn't get rid of, but it complicated many things, including onboarding journey. When you start learning Angular, the first thing you need to know is there's an ng module. What is ng module? How is it related to ES modules now that we have ES modules everywhere? So it complicates the learning process and onboarding on Angular. It also makes building Angular applications more verbose, because you have extra classes that you need to build and scaffold or stitch together. And it's extra cognitive load. It makes refactoring harder, because you have this layer of abstraction that you have to refactor if you are moving things around in the application. And it also makes things more complicated for us when we build tooling around Angular. When we build the Angular compiler, it's as I said, it's a necessary evil, but something that we were thinking for a long time how to get rid of. And the thread that you had on the screen was basically the long story of how we ended up with ng modules in the first place. And to just give a quick overview of that, ng modules were not part of Angular 2 back in 2016, until we were about to launch Angular 2, and we realized, hey, actually, this thing doesn't work. We need to do something to fix it. And there were two things that didn't work. One was the library story. We didn't have a good, solid story how to publish libraries into NPM in a way where encapsulation of these libraries would not be broken, where you could publish something to NPM, and no matter how you imported it into your project, it would still behave in the same way. And that was a big problem, because if you don't have encapsulation, you basically don't have an ecosystem. And anybody who builds platforms or languages and very heavily used APIs knows how important encapsulation is. The second issue that we saw was it was making Angular more fragile, because you needed to import things. And if you scroll down a little bit, there's a screenshot of what Angular used to look like before ng modules. A little more.
This one? No? Keep going.
No, it
keep
should
going.
be attachment. Oh, there. That one, yeah. Yes, so this is what Angular looked like prior to Angular 2 RC5, where you actually imported directives and pipes and providers as separate things into your component. And it was very fragile, because often a component in Angular has both the component part and some providers. If you use material, maybe you don't even know that there are providers that come with the component that need to be provided for the component itself. But long story short, you had to import all these things and put them into 3 different slots, and people would create these arrays, like router directives in this case was an array. People would often concatenate these arrays, and they would have all of my directives array. And nobody knew what in that array was, because it was a concatenation of 17 different arrays. And as that application grew over time, you're like, is this thing in the array? Is it not in the array? And it was basically very difficult to reason about it. So that was one challenge. The library story was even a bigger deal breaker. And ng modules gave us an abstraction to bring everything together and make the library story possible. I don't want to go into all the details why that is. If you want the thread, Twitter has some more technical details. But let's move on to what happened afterwards. We always felt that ng modules were not right, or were unnecessary complexity, but we just didn't know how to get rid of them. And we were secretly hoping that we would get rid of them, but then what we realized, oh crap, the community actually likes ng modules. They are starting to build all these things around ng modules. this is going to be very difficult to remove from Angular, because now people believe that this is actually a good thing, even though we in our hearts are not convinced that it's a good thing.
When you realized this, was it still early days, or like that the community was liking them?
Winter 2016.
Oh, that's really specific.
I remember because I remember specifically because I was at a meetup in France and in Paris after a .js conference, and I gave a talk at .js in winter of 2016. And at the meetup, I got a question about ng modules, and that was the first time when I publicly said that we're going to make them, or I'm hoping that we will make them optional at the time. And I was very specific about optional because I didn't want people to freak out that we would just like yank it out and break everything. So, and that's what we still believe. Like, that hasn't changed. We do think that ng modules, before even we can consider removing them for real, they need to be optional. And this new proposal needs to prove itself. And only if community really is behind the proposal and believes that this is the easier and the better way to build Angular applications, only then we can start making plans about, okay, is there anything left for ng module to do? Are there scenarios where ng module is still useful? And should we consider removing it eventually? So long story short, we didn't really have time to work on this. And without Ivy, it was very difficult to imagine a world without ng modules. Ivy landed last year externally, this year just recently at Google, and now that gives us flexibility to actually think about the post-Ivy world. And in the meantime, there were a few train of thoughts about how we could build ng moduleless world. Minko Gershev had a pull request that was sent out, and it's part of the thread, that had one approach. And then Pawel and I started discussing a different approach. And only this year we truly had the space and a space to focus on these things. And Pawel became available around May. And since May, we've been working quite heavily on researching this, discussing this a lot internally within the team. Because even within the team, this topic was controversial. Like, don't take us wrong.
Really? Because
yes.
the way I've heard at least team members talk about it, it was like it was more the team was ready for it, the community was not. So it's not
So
that way.
the team was ready for it. The question was how to do it, and it took us several months of discussions to agree on what is the right way. And actually, that was a good preparation for the public RFC, because many of the questions that are being surfaced now are the discussions we lived through over the summer many times over. So at this point, there's very few surprises that are coming out of the RFC, which is great, because then we don't need to be making up answers. We already tried different alternatives, and we are still looking for feedback and areas that we might have missed, and that's why we are doing RFC in the first place. But yeah, the RFC went through several iterations. Was discussed internally. GDs like you saw it about a month ago or so. There's a prototype that we built that we will show in a bit, and then the RFC went public finally last Friday, so a week ago. Here we are.
Yeah, I want to touch on, and allow you to comment if you want, that the idea of making them optional before removing them speaks volumes to Angular's typical approach to any major change, to be as non-breaking as possible, right, and to allow time to make the adjustments as necessary through a deprecation process. Although making something optional isn't necessarily making it deprecated at this point, because if it's optional, then it could potentially sit there for a release, 10 releases, 20 releases, until it's actually deprecated and removed. So that just speaks to the volume of how upgrading from version to version is as easy as possible.
Right, and maybe Pawel can speak to like interop and compatibility story, because that is a big part of the design.
And like, just kind of to specifically comment on Mike saying, I think like we've been living with ng modules for so long that we got used to them, or like we kind of stopped questioning them, even if we like if part of the community would like say like, okay, they should burn in hell and like, right, like, but other part
Only
of community,
only part.
yeah. But this is what I'm saying. Like the other part of community, it's that the ng module became like important part of the overall architecture. People see like, this is the thing that helps me structure my application. Right, like there are like different patterns of like how many modules you create per component and whatnot. So it is not black and white. And I remember this discussion with Igor, like at the beginning, I was more on this camp, like, those things should burn in hell. But like, I think Igor helped me to calibrate. This is like some people, like there are so many responsibilities and like people feel like they are helpful. So what I was trying to say that like we understand that the ng modules play the role, right? Like there is a friction, but they also play the role. And we like before any sudden moves here, we just want to make sure that all the use cases or the all those responsibilities that ng modules are playing are fulfilled in a different, like hopefully much better way, right? Like because otherwise, just like this will be doing change for nothing and like just for the sake of change, and that's absolutely not what we want.
So I have a question. When you were sharing the story, Igor, you mentioned that there were two, I guess, things early days that held you back. One was, how do we get, encapsulation for publishing libraries? Did I miss the second thing? Did you mention?
The second thing was just the fragility, the system being very fragile and required a lot of very tedious and manual work to stitching all of the dependencies, especially how to align the runtime dependencies, which are providers, and the compile time dependencies, which are directives, pipes, and components. Those two things are inseparable in Angular, but prior to ng modules, you had to manage them as two separate things. And if you imported just providers and not the components, then the components wouldn't work. If you imported just the components but not the providers, then the components behaved in an odd way. So it's part of the encapsulation story, but also just the whole. It was very tedious to get everything just right and work.
Okay, very cool. I'm really excited to dive into RFC and see how, I guess, those questions were answered on like how it's possible now. And also, I really don't, as someone who's like front end, don't understand the true differences with Ivy and the old Vue engine. And so I'm wondering what allows with Ivy, like now, for us to answer those questions, because I'm assuming you said Ivy was a pivotal point in now it's opening the door for optional.
I think that points to the whole idea of encapsulation of a library. When we're talking about libraries, or we have thus far, it's about other libraries that you would bring into your application. But Ivy being encapsulated inside of Angular, those internal changes are what's unlocking this new public-ish API. So I think it just talks to that volume of how encapsulation can help empower other things.
Yeah, Pawel, do you want to?
Yeah, no, like I mean, there were so many like restructuring in terms of like a compiler pipeline, and so I think like on top of my head, the things that like jump at me immediately is like IB is generally speaking much more dynamic in the sense that we pre-calculate less things during the compilation, which gives us those additional flex points, right? Like we can, the thing that like would be frozen in your generated code now, like went to runtime. So this gives us more flexibility. But also in terms of like compiler output, like components are more kind of encapsulated in one file. Like you probably saw like the API changes where we like remove some of the concepts and so on and so on. So just generally, I think it's like more contained in one place and more flexible at the same time, like just without going into specifics.
Right. It would be very expensive or very a lot of work to implement something like standalone components in Vue Engine in the previous pipeline, just because of a lot of oddities and architectural problems of the implementation of Vue Engine. We would have to fix those first before we could actually build something like standalone components, directives, and pipes. And we were already solving those problems with Ivy, so it didn't make sense to have like two projects where we're going to do Ivy, and we will go and fix up Vue Engine to make it compatible with standalone. That was just unsurmountable amount of work. So we because of that, we had to wait until Ivy was done, and as of version 13, which will be released a month from now, a little less, 3 weeks from now, it will not be possible to even publish libraries in Ivy format, which means we are finished with the Vue Engine to Ivy migration of the ecosystem. We will still have NGCC for the libraries that have not been updated, but that is completely separate from the Vue Engine. That is just a compatibility compiler, which then gives us this freedom to work on things that are Ivy only, features that are Ivy only.
Yeah, and just like to quickly comment on, like, it's not like we don't want to make it sound like Vue Engine is like I don't know, like we moved to a like so different, much better world and so on. It's like a learning journey, right? Like we are making different trade-offs and so on.
Right.
The other kind of, for me personally, frustrating part is that like we did so many changes in the compilation pipeline that is unlocking or makes possible so many projects that we are talking about and publishing RFCs. They are just like, this work is just like not visible, right? Like somewhere deep in the compiler or runtime. But hopefully we will see it in the changes that come to Angular.
And all of this is really hard, primarily because we don't want to break the world. We want to bring the existing community and existing applications with us. If we were able to make breaking changes, we could move much more quickly. But that's just not what Angular is. So it takes a lot of planning and coordination, and lining things up so that they land in the right order, so that the world remains intact and only gets better.
Cool. Why don't we go to like code examples?
Yes.
Let's go to standalone.
We've been
because we
24 minutes in, we haven't seen a single.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so like we are like trying different ways of introducing it, and like RFC has one story. So today we'll try something different, which is just like jump into code example and then try to tell the story starting from this. So essentially, you see like an example here of a typical component plus ng module. Well, typical, like one of the example of the component that like has some dependencies in its template, requires some here like the forms module. But the interesting thing here is that first of all, like you cannot just create this component. You need to go to this ng module thing and at least declare this component, right? So this speaks to what Igor was talking about, like the learning journey. Like, I mean, like it's impossible to create any component without introducing the concept. And like this is just like conceptual friction, but also like finger friction, in the sense like I'm creating a component, but then I have to go to another file, or like like another place in my code base, and often to a different file, and like kind of declare this component. So like you kind of like have this tandem working together. But I think more important point that we are trying to make in the RFC is that this pair, like, or like like this, like, let's say conglomerate of the component and ng modules is the minimal thing that you can kind of reason about, or like reuse, or lazy load, right? Like, I mean, the thing that we saw like for years, where people are trying to lazy load the component, right? And it makes total sense. Like, I mean, like I'm writing component, we are saying like, all those modern UI frameworks are kind of component based, where we split our application into components. But if you like search for like how to lazy load a component in Angular, like I think that there are many people that lost like countless hours just trying to figure it out. Because it's just impossible today, right? Like, because component is not self-contained. It has this context that comes with ng module, and you have to bring the whole thing for it to function correctly. So like we are giving some examples in the RFC. So it is kind of maybe advanced use case, right? Like, because not everyone is trying to lazy load a component, or not everyone is trying to dynamically instantiate a component, but it speaks volumes to the, like, what is this minimal thing that I need to deal with if I, in those small, like advanced use cases. Okay, so like you understand now, like that, like I need a couple of those things, right? And what we're doing is this proposal is just like trying to make components directives and pipes, because like the whole RFC is not about component, but of the everything. It's just more self-contained, or like really being this. Ooh, what just happened? What just happened with my slide? My beautiful slide. What happened with my slide? Hey, let me. What? Okay. Well,
animating it.
yeah.
Please excuse the technical difficulties.
Yes. So
It's
essentially,
all my fault. I was geeking out about the animation, and I made Pawel show me how he made it happen, and he touched it, and it broke, and it's all my fault. So that's on me, not you. Okay, keep going.
Cool. So anyway, so what we are trying to do is, as I said, like try to bring component directives in pipe more into this world where they are standalone or like self-contained. And by this, what we mean by this, they are like not declared in any ng module, which means they are not participating in the context of the ng module, that cannot see the providers declared on this ng module. They don't see other declarations. They cannot say import. So we are just kind of pulling it out, right? Like say like, oh, like you are different beast. Like you cannot be part of the ng module, which means like you are not getting any context from it. So this is the standalone true flag. So like at this point, this is just saying, hey, I'm a slightly different flavor of a component that I'm not like, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to have anything to do with the ng module, right? But then as soon as you do it, then like there are plenty of questions like, okay, so now how do I get my template dependencies? Because I unsubscribe myself from the ng module world. I'm alone, I'm standalone, that's fine, but it's kind of boring to be alone. So I still need to bring friends, right? Like, and this is the where the imports field comes in and saying like, hey, this is how you can participate. This is how I can see things in my template scope. But it is more than this really, because what we are bringing here is not only template dependencies, but also DI tokens. Like if the modules imported here happen to have some providers that are needed for this component, or like like somewhere in the three of those components, then they would be brought together. So we kind of bring this whole context. And like you see those plenty, you see two arrows that like animated in a very lousy way. But what they are really here just to show that conceptually how we think about it is that we in a certain sense we are merging the concept of ng module and a component, right? Like so people that are familiar with the pattern called single component Angular modules, or SCAM pattern, or like there was another abbreviation as well. That's where people were saying just basically, I want my components to be self-contained, so I will create a component and accompanying ng module as shown in this slide, and I will always have them working together. So we are essentially doing this, but on the framework level, where you just specify one flag, and you have this kind of conglomerate. That's kind of the whole RFC, really, right? Like that's assume that there are really just two things in the whole design. One is that, and it's now I'm asking myself why we needed so many pages to describe it, but but as soon as you say kind of internalize that standalone is just I'm not in the ng module. I'm just I don't want to have anything to do. I cannot be declared there. I will not be declared there. Just nothing. And the second thing that we kind of going with this SCAM pattern. We've got this called sometimes virtual ng module wrapping around the component. The whole design is there, right? That kind of explains why the imports can be here, what you can import there, and yeah.
The RFC refers to SCAM, the single component Angular module pattern, where you build one ng module per component, and basically says, you can think of this proposal as SCAM being built into the framework, but we'll take care of building the ng module for you, so you don't have to. And additionally, we make the component pipe and directive behave in the same way as ng modules, so that you can use them interchangeably. And I think it would be better to go into some of the prototype examples to explain that, because the interop is a big part of this.
Right.
We
right,
need to
right.
make sure that this, I hesitate to call it new components, because it's the same Angular components you have today. There's nothing that is radically different about them, except that they are not owned by ng module. That's the only difference. The template syntax, the semantics, all of that stuff is the same.
So while we're on the subject, I wanted to clarify, because that was probably the most confusing part of the RFC for me, was when we started talking about this virtual or scam. And I got really confused because essentially I thought that was just like a way to think about it, like a mental model to help you understand what was happening, not what was happening behind the scenes. But by some of the conversation, I was like, wait, is it actually happening? So are they truly standalone, or do they have their own secret modules?
So, if
we haven't implemented yet, right?
We're looking at the prototype that we built, and the prototype actually does create these hidden ng modules behind the scene. That is actually how the prototype works, but that is not necessarily how it must be implemented for real. It's just a cheap way to do it, and it's an easy way for us to ensure the interop works in the same way. Now, when we do the actual implementation, creating all of these ng modules behind the scene would be wasteful. And I think we can do better than that. So I think we'll squash things and implement the same semantics as if ng module was created behind the scenes, but the implementation is going to be more efficient than that. So you look at the behavior of scam with better performance. At least that's what we're aiming for.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah,
and
like
it's not going to be scam.
And thanks for this question, because it comes very often, right? Like, because like it is a mental model. There is an implementation, but this is just like so people can get a feel for the API. And again, I think like with Igor were chatting yesterday that we are probably not advertising this tag Blitz enough. And so it is linked from the RFC, but it is just the kind of mock implementation that can give you a feel for like what it would be like to interact with this new API. But it's not like the intention of implementing it this way.
So what you're presenting, that's the heart of the prototype, and it's the shim that, if you look at it, it's just a function that is called component to mimic the component decorator that behind the scenes creates an actual ng module. And
right.
For directives, components, and types.
Okay, but that's not
let's
how
go into that's the implementation detail of.
So the demo shows standalone directives and pipes too. I thought it was just
absolutely,
components.
absolutely. No.
Everything.
So that's the important part. Like, what is this? Standalone, importing standalone. Like, here we will go into the importing and the interop.
Turtles all the way down.
Yes. Where do we have?
Start from the beginning.
Wait. Like, I just want to prove that we've got. We've got pipe. We've got pipe, right? And I'm sure that we've got. Okay. From the beginning, because otherwise I would be clicking and as the kid in the candy store. So I think that's pretty much the example that we showed, right? Like in the introduction. I think the simplest possible component directed on pipe is just like about this flag, right? Like just saying I'm out of the ng modules world. That's what we are communicating here. Then what do we have here? Yeah, right. Like, so in this demo, we showed that like you can import existing ng modules. And this is so important for the interoperability story, right? Like, because this huge value in Angular ecosystem, all those ng modules that are on NPM or like, sitting in your private company repository and so on. So one of the guiding principles for the design is that we want existing ng modules to work without any changes, right? Like, just like, even if your application, you decide to go with this standalone way of doing things, you can still grab all the functionality that is out there.
Right. And this is why we're using the forms module from the Angular forms package, just to show that, this is a standalone component, but it can use forms module. Eventually, we might decide to redo the forms module to be based off of the standalone components, types, and directives. But in the meantime, the interop is preserved, and you just use everything. All of your existing components will just work. Hey, Pawel, one thing that would be useful to show is not only how these things are declared, but also how they are used. Because there are two parts, right? There's how do I declare standalone components, and then how do I use it in my existing application?
Right. So that's why I was saying, like on one hand, you can import like the modules, but equally, if you can reference standalone components inside other standalone components. I guess that's what you are referring to, right?
Yes, but it goes further, because you can also import the standalone components into engine modules. So the interop is bidirectional. Not only you can import engine modules into standalone components, but you can also take standalone components and directives and pipes. Don't forget about those. And import them into existing engine modules. So if you have a large application that is using thousands of engine modules, it's not like you have to start from scratch. You can start building new part of the application using this standalone concept, and bring it into existing application very seamlessly.
Right, and that's a great point, right? Like, because even if some people decide they've cut their applications based on engine modules, and if libraries start to publish standalone components, directives, pipes, we don't want those applications to be left out, right? So that's absolutely bidirectional.
Yeah. The biggest fear we had when we were working on this was that we would fork the ecosystem, the library ecosystem, where this new thing would be completely different, and you would have to start from scratch, and whoever builds the standalone components would be in this new island that is small initially, and eventually would grow, and then the people that have ng modules would be left on an island, and we didn't want any islands. We wanted this to be seamless in both ways.
So that brings up an interesting point. You're talking about the interop and being able to pull in ng module-based components into a standalone component. And I understand that this is still moving pieces and not finalized. But if I have a standalone component and I want to pull in a component that's in a module, would it then be best to pull in the module for that component instead of the actual component, because that specific component probably doesn't know about any dependencies that it has except via the module?
Right, and that's an excellent question. That was weeks of banging our head against this very specific question. So currently in the current design, if a component is not a standalone, you cannot import it like this, right? You can only
directly.
You have to import the ng module where it is declared. And again, this goes very to the beginning of the conversation, where if you are declared in ng module, you are making friends with all those other things, right? With the DI providers, with the other directives that might be needed to cooperate on the same element. Maybe one directive is injecting another directive, so you might have clusters of those collaborating directives. So if you've got this group of friends, and then you decide one day oh, I'm going to pull out one guy out of this group, you lose all the context. So that's what that's actually why we need the standalone, right? Just to say it's okay to kind of interact with me without looking at the associated context.
Yeah, and our thinking is that it will be an error if you import a non-standalone component directly. So we'll tell you, hey, you cannot import this component directly. And also, if you do the opposite, if you try to declare a standalone component as part of the ng module in the declarations field, then that's going to be an error, because you cannot declare a standalone component in that field.
Right. So I don't want to kind of click through all the demos because they are available. I just want to show just one that is slightly full of hacks, but so I will scroll so you don't see the hacks. but essentially, when we are saying, I mean, you can, if you want to see hacks, there's a link to study.
Everyone's
Okay.
like clicking over to the Stack Blitz. Where are the hacks?
Yeah. Well, so this is the what we were saying about the, like, being able to reason about components, like standalone components in isolation, where you can load them completely, like using dynamic imports and like kind of inject, like instantiate them inside the application. Router could do those things. I mean,
Yeah, I think it would be better if you could contrast this with what it looks like now. But I don't think we have that readily
I don't think
available.
I've got enough space in this slide to actually contrast it.
Yeah. So right now, if you want to dynamically, especially if you go all the way back to with View Engine, the way to dynamically instantiate components would be to fetch the ng module factory. You out of the factory you get you use ng module factory resolver to
component factory resolver, right?
component factory resolver. From
To
there,
get component factory.
you get component factory, and then you use the component factory to call into the view component ref to create. So it's like 5 different steps you have to go through that with this proposal could be replaced with 2 lines. One is to import the component, and the second one is to create component.
And again, like I just don't want to make it the whole RFC about this use case, because it might sound like it's advanced, right? Like maybe as a developer, I never dynamically created things, but dynamic instantiation happens all the time. Like router does it, bootstrapping application does it, and so on. So like it goes very deeply into the how like the framework is structured internally.
ng Bootstrap and Angular material components, they do it all the time. All the dialogues, tooltips, and like more sophisticated components, they do dynamic component instantiation all the time. Can we? Oh, sorry.
That's okay. With the different instantiation of standalone components versus modularized components, will that be something that libraries may need to take into account if they want to instantiate a new component with the module systems that they have in place, or modal systems, for example?
It will get simpler. We do expect that libraries will be affected in a positive way, where the APIs that they expose currently will become simpler. Today, most of these APIs expose, they request that you provide a component and ng module ref. That is the typical thing. And ng module ref is going away because we don't need ng module ref. And the reason why you need 2 was because if the library accepted just the component, it didn't have enough context to actually instantiate that component properly. So now that second argument will become optional. And you can already see it in the create component API, view container ref create component. In version 13, we changed the signature of this particular API to be component centric. So component is the only required argument. All the other ones are optional. And they really shouldn't be, because you should still always pass in ng module.
I was going to say, I assumed you would pass like none or something. Like if it's just optional, you don't have to do anything. Yeah,
we made it optional, but they're only. I don't want to go into details. That API has a lot of historical baggage associated with it and pain, and it should have looked differently even in the past, but it didn't. So now we fixed it, and it's going to be all good, especially once the standalone components land.
It sounded like you wanted to head in a different direction after this, or was I misreading?
What do you mean?
I think I interrupted you with a question.
No, I think like what I was saying is that, like, I think it's like the demo is out there, right? So people can play it.
Right.
But I think it's also interesting, like to like, I don't know if there are like questions, or because this is the hard stuff, right? Like on RFC, it's just like asynchronous interaction.
Right.
So if
the thing I did want to show off was the
Oh,
Bootstrap API, because and Pawel did an excellent job of highlighting that one line in the RFC. Many people don't realize that the minimal unit of reuse in Angular today is ng module. And with this proposal, we are changing it to be a component directive and pipe. And what that allows us to do is to change APIs to not take ng modules into account and be more focused on components, directives, and pipes. For example, today when you bootstrap an application, you're bootstrapping an ng module. With this proposal, you're actually bootstrapping a component. And this is what the proposed, not implemented yet, Bootstrap API could look like with this proposal.
Yeah. So essentially, the whole like minimal Angular application could be like boiling down to like I've got a component. I'm saying like importing Bootstrap component, like of some sort of API, and just saying go, which means that the learning journey could be very different, right?
Easier. Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
we don't need to be talking about platform. We don't need to be talking about ng modules. We don't need to be talking about many other things. And we can just say, there's a component, you bootstrap it, done.
Right. And like something I want to like really highlight is that, like we absolutely don't want people that like ng modules to feel like left alone. So we are like, we are like having those new toys and like, oh, we can simplify this API and can simplify that API and so on and so on. Yeah. Again, like we absolutely recognize the central role of ng modules. I think like the kind of important insight here is that ng module often is used just to group things, right? Like, so we created this Angular specific class to say like all those things go together. So I think like our potential path forward is just like, lean more on JavaScript, and like if you've got a group of things, why not use just JavaScript exports, right? Like why not to export just like regular objects? Why do we need to have Angular specific class to say that you want to group things? So again, like it will take time to go over all the use cases and all the APIs that currently use ng module. But I think the general theme is like lean on JavaScript more where we can.
Lars asked a question of how do you imagine the Bootstrap component being different from render component? I didn't know if you saw that.
I absolutely want to answer this question because so like render component, like now Igor like just stop me if I will go too far, but like I'm so sad that it even surfaced. It never meant to be a like public API. It's just when we were like implementing Ivy and we were like writing unit tests and like various logging points and so on, like it's really a leftover from the implementation, right? Like you really should see it as a private API. It's just, and I kind of like, I'm really so sad that it kind of got out of the bag because, and started to be used in public because it's just like lots of sharp edges.
Yeah, and we should clarify that. It's not that we would love a render component or we would love a rendering of components
API like
simple. The challenge there is that API is flawed and completely incompatible with how Angular works today. So going from where we are to something like render component would be a big breaking change, and would be the thing that would fragment the ecosystem, because you would have these components that work very differently than existing components. So right now that API is unreachable. Maybe as we evolve the framework, as we go through standalone components, the next thing is zoneless. That's one of the things that render component doesn't completely ignores. It ignores zones. So if we have zoneless and standalone, then render component is within the reach, but it's still a lot of work to get there.
Right, and I think like just like like showing this Bootstrap type of API, just like it's a testimony of this, that like it is possible. Like it is like behind the scene, Bootstrap needs to do something like render component. So there is no reason to not give this API, but like the current render component is not this API. Just like it's like lots of pain and sorrow that you are setting yourself up.
Right. So and the bootstrap component is essentially a superset of render component. It's render component and many more other things that render component ignores.
Can you go back up to the first demo example?
Sure.
Just because I think this is important just for people to establish the right mental model when they're looking at this. On that first line, you're importing component from your standalone shim.
Yeah, that's like that's only because like that's obviously in the final would be.
Yeah, it would look exactly like your components do now from that import, and it would be additional logic or functionality added to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like it won't change.
Okay. I just want people to establish that as they're looking at this. You don't have to have a separate component defined. This is just to make it work in Stacklet so you can play with it today, and it'll change. And just that one import would change to get this functionality.
Yeah.
Okay.
We should actually add a comment, Pawel, to
yeah, probably. It's kind of funny, right? Like because on one hand, we like it's really just tool to like play with the API. Just like don't like try to infer implementation from it.
Right. And if you look at the index.html one, do the open the preview, please. The preview.
Yeah.
So that one has a little bit of narrative, and then shows might be actually easier for people to look at than the actual code. The code is there to just prove that it works, but this one is just copy paste of the code, and scroll down a little bit for there is a demo.
We just don't show imports right here.
And
so
in
that
some, at least it used to be that there were the usages, how to use. Can you scroll down a little more? I thought okay, maybe it's not there.
I don't know, like what we...
Maybe it was refactored. There was just like how, because again, all of this stuff is two things, like declaration of the standalone component, and then you somehow bring it into an application. And in this case, it's often the standalone component is imported into existing ng module, the ng module is bootstrapped. One thing that we could talk about just briefly, because that surfaced in the RFC discussion, was automated migration and the plans. Do you want to, Paul, talk about that a little bit?
Just go ahead. I think I was talking too much.
I can. That's fine. So the question that was surfaced was, this looks good, but could we build tooling to move existing code bases over to standalone? Is that automatable? And the answer is yes, most of the time. If you are using SCAM, single component Angular module today, that is fully automatable. We can just drop the ng module, add the standalone, and replace all of the call sites where today you have the SCAM module with the standalone component. So we can build a schematic that will just go and just do magic with your code base. And that should be fully safe, and we'll see, but it should be safe. It should be a very safe and straightforward migration. If you are not using SCAM, things are slightly trickier because it's not always obvious how things are wired and what we would need to do to break up bigger ng modules into many small standalone components, directives, and pipes. And that's because providers, there are like these different, there's runtime dependencies and compile time different dependencies, and they're not always fully statically analyzable. So that migration, we think, at least in 90%, maybe in more cases, we can fully migrate that code over to standalone. But we know that there will be some cases where developer intervention will be necessary. And maybe we'll just do our best and say, hey, developer, can you please review this and see? And of course, if you have unit tests and integration tests, then that will help a lot to ensure that the migration was done safely. But yes, we are definitely thinking about automating the migration. And this is also where the flag comes, the standalone flag in the component directive comes in play. Many people, and even prior to us going to RFC, there was half of the discussion was about syntax, and half of the discussion was about semantics. And it's funny because the syntax is like such a small part of this proposal. It's really the semantics that are very difficult in this case. But people question: do we need a flag? Can we do it without the flag? And RFC goes in depth into the reasoning why the flag is necessary, or why at least we need some kind of syntactical hint for both humans as well as for compiler to be able to go through this transition and do it without losing sanity. So if you if you question, do we need a syntactical element? Please look at the RFC. All the details are there. There's also a design document that is more goes even into more details. That is linked from the RFC. So if you really want to see the nitty gritty, then you can go into the design document. Yep.
Oh, nice.
But the second theme of the discussion was is flag the right way? So if we agree that syntactical element is the right thing, is flag the right syntactical element? Because there are alternatives. We could have additional set of decorators like add standalone component, or I saw Rob suggested in the RFC that it could be add ng component and add ng directive and add ng pipe, and those would be the standalone ones. Another thing that we considered was having the existing component that we have, directive, but extended through the static property. So you would write add component dot standalone parentheses, and then you would write your metadata. We considered all of these, and the thing that we the reason why we stuck with the field is because three things. We don't want to create this perception that this is a very different kind of component, because it's not. It's the same old component that you know and like, and the only difference about it is that it's not associated with ng module. So creating a new decorator would kind of suggest that, hey, this is a very different component. Now you have to go and learn this new thing. You don't need to learn anything new, except forget about ng modules, components, directives, and pipes are all you need to know. The second thing was that we wanted to set ourselves up for possible migration in the future. If this proposal is accepted by the community and everybody agrees that this is the way to go, then using the flag, we can actually, in the future version, say this flag is required for all of the components, and we'll have a migration that will go through all of the existing code bases, and we'll just say standalone false. And once we have everybody locked into true or false, then we can flip the default. And once the default is flipped, then standalone can become optional. And for all of the new stuff, you don't need to specify it at all. And all of this can be automatable, fully automatable, safe migration done over several major versions. But that is a very smooth path. And lastly, creating another directive or the static property would require a lot of changes in the existing ecosystem. So the language service would have to change. Schematics would have to change in a dramatic way. You would need to teach many of the existing refactoring tools or other tools what these ng components are, and really just alias them to components. And it just seems like a lot of work, a lot of churn for very little benefit. So for these reasons, we decided that the flag is probably the easiest and the safest approach, and an approach that would help us roll this out in the easiest and the smoothest way.
I know that we are running against the top of the hour, but there was a very important question, at least I consider it to be an important question, about testing within the chat, that is asking how you would go about testing standalone components, because the testing mentality now, as you establish your tests in the environment which they're running, is by creating a module. So can we talk about how you would set up essentially that ecosystem to be able to test the standalone component?
Right.
By be able to, and still providing any of the necessary dependencies, being components, directives, and what have you.
So I think we've got like very kind of rough proposal, and I'm sorry for scrolling. I mean, I know that it's just.
Oh no, that's fine, because that points to the fact that to get more detailed answers, we can refer to the doc.
Yeah. No, I know that it just creates this like very unpleasant visual effect, but essentially, I think like with many APIs, our hope is that like it can only get easier in the sense that since you're like you can think about your standalone components as already wrapped in a virtual ng module, then like you just don't have to create it, right? Like it's there. So like that's the mental model you can use. So which means that like we could just like set up things like without like all this ceremony, but still be able to override. And again, like I don't want to say like, oh, this is the API that will like. I mean, there are many changes, but the spirit is here. Like if you don't need to override anything, then like you just basically say like, oh, I want to instantiate this component of we go, which is form of the render component, right? So like it shows that there are many APIs that need it. But so like definitely there are many APIs that are currently heavily based on ng module, and we will have to review them. But again, the hope is that like if anything happens to them, they will get easier rather than anything.
Yeah, and there's one more question about how will a human know whether a component should be imported as a component or as a ng module? And the answer there is we're hoping to make the language service smarter so that they can help you import things in the right way. So we want to heavily lean on auto-completion using language service. And if you don't use language service, then the compiler will tell you you cannot import module full components directly, or you cannot declare standalone components with an ng module. So those will be compilation errors. But again, we're trying to catch that even before you get to compilation errors by doing better auto-completion.
Just double checking chat. Mike, are there any other questions that we wanted to field?
I didn't see anything else. Lars and I are chatting about the idea of how if a library is exposing both a module and a component, which one do you use? And if it's exposing the same component, well, actually, I couldn't expose both because
it can. Right. Like so this is funny part. Like, and I think like I will have to do this scrolling again. But like we've got a section about the libraries, right? Like where we try to cover, and essentially, I think for backward compatibility, we still like want to like kind of interoperability. We still want libraries to be able to publish both. So like I don't want to go into the details, but like I'm afraid that we might have like a longer discussion about like what people would prefer to import, right? Like because some people will say like I love granularity, and we can see this in the comments in the RFC, and that people say like I want to almost like specify like like item by item everything that I'm using in my template. And some people say like you are completely nuts, right? Like you just I'll have to like type so much and so on. I want to just import one big thing. So there is also this interesting I won't say tension, but like preference. So technically, I think as the library, you will have freedom. The question is, what is the people preference, and like where the ecosystem will go? That's kind of interesting.
And this is where we want the feedback. We want people to play with this stuff. One of the things that doesn't work today, but we want to do, is to add support for star imports, so that you could do import star from some kind of component library, and then use that star import as the thing that you import into your component, and that way you can import multiple things in a single shot, if that's what you want to do. So I think what we'll do is we'll just enable these things and have the community play with these things, and then monitor, what the other preferences, what kind of patterns will emerge from the real usage.
I love it. I am so appreciative for both of you taking the time to walk us through the proposal and just answering questions. This has been really, really amazing. I didn't know if either one of you had any picks or anything you wanted to shout out to, or any Any other points you wanted to make sure we touched on today?
I have a few.
Can I ask? I have one last quick question for me. Release time, and I'm not asking you to commit to a time frame or anything else. But
Tomorrow.
but is this a major release constraint? Meaning, would this need to wait until at least 14, or could it be potentially a dot release for 13?
I think there will be changes that we would want to roll out in major release, but maybe we can prepare the foundation in the minor release. This is an optional change. It doesn't force you into migration. So there are parts of this that we could release as a part of the minor release, and then migrations and stuff like that could be part of the major release. One thing to realize is that there are several parts to implementation here. There's the runtime part, there's the compiler part, but then there's the CLI integration. We probably want to change the schematics so that you can scaffold components as standalone. We probably want to update the style guide to give you some guidance about standalone components. We might need to update some of our documentation. So there's a lot of, except for just the core engineering work, there's a lot of follow-up work. And when we did just the back of a napkin estimation, we think that it's basically roughly 9 SWE months and engineering months worth of work total. Rough estimate. So if you have 3 engineers, they could crank it out in 3 months in an ideal scenario.
If you've got 18.
Which never happens. Sorry?
I was saying if you've got 18 engineers. Then.
If you have 18 engineers, then you're screwed because they will argue about semicolons and.
Oh, you've got diminishing returns. I see what you're saying.
Are we doing the book review?
Yeah. So I cannot commit to any timelines right now, but I do want to just reinforce that there are parts of this that could be released in a minor release, but there's a lot of follow-up work that cannot be forgotten and underestimated because it's real work, and if we want to have a good developer experience, then that needs to happen. Language service support and all of these things.
Makes total sense. I'm done with questions.
Cool.
All right, Igor, you said you had some thoughts. Yes, picks. Thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna pick the Angular team because one of the things that I want to bring up over and over again, and I mentioned it in other talks this week, is that you see just 2 of us today, but there are many other people that were part of the discussion, and we need to give credit to them because this RFC would not happen without their time and contributions. So many people on the Angular team contributed, many GDs helped us, many customers helped us with feedback. So just big shout out to Angular team and Angular community. Thank you for making this happen and helping us get this far. And then I have 4 other non-Angular picks, but let's mix it up.
I think it's absolutely brilliant how you just bring these numbers up seemingly out of nowhere, like how you keep track of things in your head, whereas like I would have to have like a notebook to be able to like list out the things. You can just like you have 4 things coming up, and I'd be like, how many things do I'm just amazed. I'm impressed. Pawel, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we get to non-Angular-y picks?
Yeah, like so this is like annoying, like when Igor got asked this question before me, right? Like because that's essentially the first thing that comes to my mind, and I so like next time we have to no, but it is so like what was pretty amazing for me is the whole process. Like it was like really for years we were thinking about it, and what was very interesting for me is that like there were like nuggets of insights that someone was dropping, right? Like someone would say like, oh, I thought this, right? Like, and this would stick in your brain, and then like for months, like nothing would happen. And someone else would say like, oh, like I thought about it like this, right? and so on. And the design was being finalized when Alex was here in France. Like in my time zones, we could like kind of like chat more and so on. And like so those are those kind of little moments which seem like inconsequential, but then like over the long period of time where you just kind of pull them together. And this is for me just kind of the teamwork at its best, where you try to accumulate those different things, and like you're also not rushing. Like we knew that this is such a big and central API, right? Like that it's no point just to run with the first thing that comes to your mind.
No, I was impressed to hear that it's been in the works that long, because I know earlier before the show we were talking about how I think officially you were working on it since May, was it? Like thinking about it, building it together, but then looking at Igor's story and like apparently it was since version 2, so that it's been in the works as a brainchild. So.
Yeah, there was like a background process, I guess, in many people's heads. Yeah.
All right, it's time for non-Angular picks. I asked Mike off stage on Slack, and he does not have any picks. So you two are up. What do you got?
Okay, I shared a few links with you, so you can post them later. I have 2 music picks. I'm a big fan of. Well, I was gonna say new and old, but Daft Punk and Prodigy are not new anymore because I'm too old. But there are two videos that really caught my eye, and I don't know. I think it was Pete Bacon Darwin who suggested one of them, and that's how I discovered the other one. So there's this orchestra called New Deco Ensemble, and it's a full orchestra, and they do amazing things. And one of them is that they covered Daft Punk, which is a big part of my life. Let's put it that way. And it's totally fabulous. So I love this combination of all the new. So if you like Daft Punk and if you like orchestral music, this is a very interesting take on that. In a similar vein, there is another orchestra called Prime Orchestra, and they did a cover of Prodigy, which is even more insane because I don't know if you know Prodigy. That was just something that I grew up with as a kid. But if somebody told me that Prodigy can be covered by an orchestra, I would say no way. But these guys have done it, and it's amazing, amazing. So those are my 2 music picks, and then I have 2 books that I want to recommend. One is Working in Public.
I hope that you are not stealing the books that I was thinking of. Working in Public by I'm terrible with names. Nadia Iqbal. I hope I'm not butchering her name. But it's from Stripe Press, which they publish amazing books. If you don't have any Stripe Press books, please check out Stripe Press. Working in Public is all about open source and how open source works. And it's when I read this book, I laughed and cried because it's so good. It's all of these stories that happened over the last 15, 20 years in open source that nobody really collected in one place. And it's written by a non-engineer, so it's written by somebody who's kind of distant and is just trying to understand this crazy world and how it works and what are the dynamics and how do we make software in this weird open way. I highly recommend it. It's very good. It's very well structured, very well researched, and there are lots of references to tweets and pull requests that some of you might know. So it was funny to see that in the book. And the last book that I have is What Doesn't Kill You. It's a book about really how would I say it? About the strength of human mind and human body, and how far you can push it, and it's just amazing. I love
like
what
as
the
far as
human.
like physically, like working out
Oh.
type push it, or
Kind of both. So the book
Mhm.
the book covers this journey of a journalist that set out to prove that this guy called Wim Hof is fraud. Wim Hof is I think he's a Dutch guy, and he's been preaching cold therapy and meditation as a way to build a strong immune system and be mentally very fit. And this journalist is like, okay, this is total fraud. I'm gonna go and prove that this guy is a liar, and I'm gonna expose him. And it's his journey. And by the end of the book, he's a convert, and he's a believer. He's a believer, and it's just I find it interesting because I've been looking into the space of meditation and human mind and how all of that stuff works for years at this point. But this is a new take on that, and it just shows
Mhm.
that there's just so much that we don't understand about human body and human mind, and we should just keep on exploring. And I just love that space.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, chat, all those links are in the chat. And I think, Powell, you had a non-Angular pick for us as well.
Yeah, right. Like so I think like generally speaking, like it's an advice to myself more than to anyone, but like people that get outdoors, like just go for a walk, go for a run, go for a bike ride, because like this is something I neglected over the like last months and weeks, and it
Mm.
doesn't do good to your brain. not mentioning body. But I think more generally speaking, what I wanted to talk about, and hopefully Mike can share a link. I find it fascinating that like in our industry we spend so much time learning like new tools, languages, compilers, whatnot. But I feel like we don't spend enough time like learning about this machine that we've got here. So like just brain science in general, I think is just huge. Like for me, this is the biggest investment I made in like myself, and like like tons of like learning new languages, and like wouldn't like technology wouldn't bring me to the place where I am right now. So yeah, just I think it's just equally valuable to understand your languages and compilers, but also how your internal computer works. So there are obviously like tons of books and so on, but like the one that Mike shared is like I kind of like it. Read it like a few years ago, but it was like funny and very informative. So yeah.
Thank you both so much. These are awesome. I have put them in the chat so everybody can reference them. And for the playback, they were on screen as well. But also, I just want to shout out for the RFC. Seen a lot of feedback, but if you have any questions, comments, concerns, ideas, RFC is still going. It's going strong. So please send them the Angular team's way. And also just a big thank you for not only the work that you did, but everyone who's been a part of this RFC for a very long time now, apparently. So thank you so much for coming on. This was amazing.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Have a wonderful Friday, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.